Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Pine Hollow Auto Diagnostics. Most of the snow melted, but it's cold and windy today. And we have a 2006 Honda Accord V6 from New Jersey to diagnose. Let's get inside here where it's a little less windy. Whew. So what's the history of this car? Well, the owner said he can't get it to pass the New Jersey state inspection because the check engine light keeps coming on with a random misfire code. So he said he changed the coils and plugs. That didn't fix anything. I asked him about the history of the vehicle. It has 205,000 miles on it. And these Hondas at higher miles, he says the misfire only occurs at idle. You can feel it. It shakes. We'll start up the engine here soon. And when you're driving on the highway, it drove perfectly fine here. So it's a misfire at idle, rough running at idle. Two common culprits. Either the EGR valve gets slightly stuck open and that causes, rough running at idle, or valve clearances at a higher mileage, over 200,000 miles. If the valve clearances get tight and the valves aren't closing all the way, that could also explain these symptoms. So two possibilities here that we're going to chase down. Let's do a code scan. We have 7 codes. Well, some of them are repeats. There's a misfire, random misfire, P0300. Then we have cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 misfires. Okay, so not a specific cylinder, just random cylinders. I don't know if Honda has misfire counters in the engine computer, data stream, but we can definitely look. So let me pull up some live data. We'll do a cold start on this thing, see how it runs. Okay, luckily we do have misfires on all cylinder specific. So let's graph these. Start up the car. CD does some weird noises. So right now it's not running too bad. Pretty good, good to rev up, but there is some roughness at idle. So it looks like cylinder 1 is counting up pretty quickly. Look at that. So I'm going to take a screenshot of that. And you can hear a little tapping under the hood. I asked the customer, is this thing an oil burner? And he said no, he doesn't have to top off the oil. So that's good. But if he's been running it this way, it's actually his wife's car, for a long time with tight valves, is it possible that the valve could get burnt? It is possible. So it does feel like a single cylinder misfire now at idle. You can even listen to the exhaust pipe. Yeah, we got the putt. Alright. So some people might say, well, why don't you just adjust the valves? Well, the book time on this is 5 hours, like 4.5 hours. It's not a 4-cylinder where you can do it in an hour. This is a V6. You gotta take the intake manifold off, both valve covers. It has twice as many valves. So my procedure here would be, we know cylinder 1 is the worst, but according to scan data. I want to do a relative compression check and see if cylinder 1 is low on compression. If it is, I want to actually go in there with a borescope and take a look at these valves, because if the valves are actually damaged or burnt, then doing a valve adjustment would be a waste of customers' money and my time. I don't want to do that. So before quoting the customer on a valve adjustment job, let's do that relative compression test and see if cylinder 1 is low on compression. Alright, Honda is in the shop. Let's do some research online. for this relative compression test. And I always emphasize this: the time you spent doing the research and making a game plan will pay dividends in the actual test on the car. It will go much smoother, faster, and you'll get accurate results if you follow your game plan. So to do this relative compression test, first thing I want to do is disable the fuel injectors. And what feeds the fuel injectors? This PGM FI main relay, okay, and they're all the injectors. So that's the power feed. But I do want to sync my scope with an ignition event, like cylinder 1 ignition coil. So we don't want to disable ignition. Here's the wiring diagram for the ignition coils, and they are fed by a separate ignition coil relay through fuse 2. So if we just pull this PGM-FI main relay 1, our ignition should still be good and the coil should still fire. That's what we want. So we'll have to locate this PGM-FI main relay, and under dash fuse box, this middle relay right here, pin 20 or item 21, that's the PGM-FI main relay 1. 23 is the ignition coil relay, which we're not going to touch. So 21 is right there, right in the middle. So we're going to pull that out, and then we need to know, well, where is cylinder number 1? So here's the firing order: 1, 4, 2, 5, 3, 6, and Honda is kind of like Ford. They label their cylinders in a row. So I want to sync the scope with cylinder 1 and measure the current at the battery for the starter, right at the battery with an amp clamp. So 2 channels on the scope. Let's go set that up. Alright, so right by the dash, remove that plastic kick panel, and this one right here in the middle is our PGM-FI main relay. So I want to grab that gently with the Scotty Kilmer VAMPLIERS because they have really nice grip, and pull this sucker out. Okay, so that's fuel injectors are disabled. Now let's go set up our scope. By the way, the owner told me he did replace the EGR valve about a year ago to, I guess, combat some kind of misfire problem. And he got this at AutoZone, so that's suspect. However, that would not explain a misfire just on cylinder 1. This is even though it's setting codes for 5 out of 6 cylinders, we're chasing this cylinder 1 problem. That is, the big fish here. So, scope is connected. Connect device. There we go. So like I said, 2 channels. So channel 1 is going to be our amp clamp on the high setting. So 1 volt will be 100 amps. Usually starters draw about less than 200 amps, so we're well within range. It's on the negative battery cable because it's easier to clamp than the positive, and your current's going to be going back towards the battery. That's why the jaws are facing this way. So picture the current going through the jaws that way. So that's channel 1, so let's set that up. Our maximum is going to be 2 volts. So we can set it on a 2 volt scale down here. And channel 2 is going to be the sync on ignition coil number 1. I just have the control wire back probe. That's the PCM control wire. Should be like a little square wave. So we'll know when cylinder 1 is at TDC. So we're ready to go. Let's crank this thing over. Alright, here we go. I'm just going to hold the throttle to the floor to have a consistent test. I think it has a mechanical throttle body. So let's crank it over for a few seconds. I did not see a control pulse on our second channel. The CD thing is annoying. But do we see a high or low current pulse in this current waveform? What you can do on channel 1, thank goodness, you can activate filtering to clean up that waveform a little bit. That looks decent. And see, I see a high hump right there. So as every 6th hump 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Is every sixth hump high? We really need the sync here. And we can put the rulers in 6 partitions and use a cursor to kind of gauge where the peaks are. Are there any consistently low humps? Looks like high. It kind of goes down. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then high again. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, high again. So the one before the high, before the high one, is that consistent? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So yes, the discrepancy here between the high and the previous kind of decreases. So between this one and this one, I see a difference every time. Boom, boom. So I'm suspecting that cylinder number 1 is the lowest, but I wish the ignition coil would trigger here, and it does not with that PGM F5 relay out of the picture. How can we do this easier? I need a sync. We could install a cylinder pressure transducer on that cylinder, but installing a transducer introduces a little extra volume into the cylinder with the pressure hose. So doing a relative compression test with a sync using the pressure transducer, that's a little cause extra variables. Let me figure out if we can keep this car from starting but still have ignition. Okay, so I got cylinder number 1 spark plug out, and it actually looks wet with gas. So that confirms our misfire that we saw in the scan data. So I just want to put a pressure transducer in here and use that as a sync. We'll repeat our relative compression test, and we can see on the waveform if we're losing compression. If we are, we're going in there with a borescope looking at these valves. Alright, so my pressure transducer is installed. It's turned on, so it's on channel 2 like the ignition coil sync was. Now let's set up the scope. So all we need to do is change channel 2 setting to see the pressure transducer. Let's do that real quick. So channel B now is going to be, well, these are custom scales that I have available. If you purchase the transducer, you'll get the link to download these scales. So we're at 0 psi, that's the red trace, and 0 on the amp clamp. Full throttle. Okay, let me change the scale a little bit. Let's do 135. Okay, pretty decent compression. Let me change the scale one more time so we can get that on the screen. So minus 25 to 225. Okay, let's analyze data. Alright, so now you could hear clearly here that one of the cylinders was a little low in compression, and that's the one that we installed the cylinder pressure transducer on. So that's what I was saying. It increases the volume of the cylinder a bit, and it makes that hump even lower than it was before. Now let's see if we actually lost any mixture in the cylinder during the compression event. So what you can do is you want to see if the tower is leaning at all. So I have 3 rulers here, and you can put them at the intersection of, you know, whatever pressure, like right there. You see both rulers are right at the intersection, and the middle one should bisect this hump exactly. And what do you know, it doesn't quite bisect it. So the tower's leaning over a little bit to the right, so this slope is a little bit less. However, our peak pressure is at over 150 psi. That's pretty good. I mean, that's pretty good sealing. If you had a bad valve, you would think you would see less or lower peak pressure. So the pressure actually looks better than I expected. But we need a known good to compare this to. Let's go to like cylinder number, whatever, easy to get one, 1, 2, 3, I guess cylinder number 4. Do this same check and see if our peak pressure is like 200 instead of 150. We definitely have a problem on number 1. And then we can go in there with a borescope and check it out. Alright, so I put the plug back in number 1. Now we're in number 4 with the pressure transducer. Let's repeat the exact same experiment, see what the peak pressure is on that one. Okay, so scope is set up, ready to go. Hit the go button. Let's crank this thing over. Maybe I should put a charger on the battery. Let's see what happened. Okay, so here's cylinder number 4. So before we were just over 150 psi, and now we're up to 163. So 10 psi higher, not a huge difference. You can see that hump is lower than the rest now, so the pressure transducer hose does make a difference on the relative compression test. And what was our firing order? Firing order was 142536. So now we're on the next in line. So this is cylinder number 1. Cylinder 4 is a little lower now. And then you keep going. So would a 10 psi peak compression difference make this cylinder misfire pretty badly at idle? Well, well, we're to the paved road, and it actually runs smoother now. Minus 5%, plus 5%. Much smoother. Put it in gear. Under a little bit of load. Long-term started learning there, but close to 0. Oh, a little rougher. You can see the camera shaking a little bit. Look, that dropped down to minus 10%. Okay, so there's still discrepancy, but on a cold start it was worse. Very interesting. Let's take it for a rip. Alright, here we go. I'm sure it's going to run just fine. Still got it, 205,000 miles. Very smooth. Take a look at our data here. Yeah, bank 2 is running just slightly rich. I mean slightly, like 4%. Bank 1 is positive 4%, so still discrepancy of about 10% between the banks. Okay. So after driving for a little bit, cylinder 1 starts counting up more and more. 3 counted a few, cylinder 6 counted 1, well 5 I guess. 1, 3, and 6, interesting. 2, 4, and 5 are perfect. Yeah, cylinder 1 right now is not happy. Alright, so the last step that I want to do in terms of diagnostics on this Honda Accord before calling valve clearances is to do a running in-cylinder transducer check, cylinder 4 versus cylinder 1. So I'm going to back the car out, warm it up to operating temp, pull it in here, hook up the pressure transducer, we'll do cylinder 4, start it up, let it stabilize, do a snap throttle, do the same on number 1. Hopefully we'll see a discrepancy in compression, and then we'll call the customer and tell them, hey man, your valves need to be adjusted. Alright, pressure transducer is connected. We're going to do cylinder number 4 first. Let's fire it up, let it idle, do a snap throttle, and then move to cylinder number 1. Alright, here we go. Let's fire this thing up. So the injectors, everything's still enabled. Ignition coil is obviously disconnected. Let's do 1 snap throttle. So it comes back up to about 70 psi. Okay, let's shut that off and move to cylinder number 1. Okay, so cylinder number 4, here's the waveform. Looks awesome. Very nice sealing. See, the vacuum pocket does not drop below the initial value. And the peak is about 70 psi. So that's our known good. I saved that. Let's roll the scope. I'm on cylinder number 1 now. Alright, here we go. Cylinder number 1. It's misfiring. It's coming back to the, no, a little less. Look at that. It was higher here, lower here. Very interesting. Let's take a look at that data. Alright, let's take a look at cylinder number 1. So before our peak compression was 70, now this one's down to 60. More than 10% compression loss. So I'd say that's cylinder 1 is definitely low in compression. We know that by, let's say, 10 psi, which is significant. You know, if you're at 150 versus 160, might not be, you know, you might be within spec, but at idle, if you're at 60 versus 70, that's going to make a difference. And why would bank 1 be showing rich? Only bank 1. Can anyone answer that in the comments? Okay, so after thinking about this waveform for a little bit and comparing to cylinder 4, this pressure differential down here between, so vacuum is minus 8.8 psi, and we come up here to this little vacuum pocket, so it's higher, it's minus 7.3, so about 1.5 psi difference. So if the intake valve was leaking, remember, this is intake vacuum right here. So even if it, you know, pushed out some mixture on the intake stroke or on the compression stroke into the intake manifold, as it comes down here, let's say the intake valve is leaking, everything should try to pull this to vacuum. whatever's inside the cylinder and the intake manifold should be pulling through that, whatever little gap in the valve. So the only way this makes sense is if the exhaust valve is leaking exhaust gas back into the cylinder. So right here it pushes some mixture into the exhaust, and then once it drops below the 0 line, there's some vacuum in the cylinder, and then the exhaust gas starts feeding back into the cylinder. That's why this is a little higher than this. And that explains the put out of the exhaust pipe. So let's get a borescope in cylinder number 1. If we don't see any burnt valves or anything crazy like that, we're calling valve clearance. So we got the TESLONG NTS 500 in cylinder number 1. I'm trying to look at these exhaust valves. So they're actually both open right now, which is handy. And looking at the surface, this one here looks, you can see that, it's kind of speckled. And this one is just kind of gray and white on the surface. Maybe the camera's not picking that up very well. There's a difference between the two valves. So that's kind of suspicious. Now looking at the seats, again, you can't really get a perfect view here. These seats are definitely not perfect, but we have to go after valve clearances. If they're not, if they're right on that threshold or a little too tight, you'll have a partial misfire for sure. So I don't see any chunks like burnt out of them, so that's good. We're not going to be wasting our time doing a valve lash check. At least we'll start with cylinder number 1, see if those are tight, and then check the rest of them while we're in there. Obviously, is the seat on this valve any different? It might be. I'll see if I can get a better picture. Does that look a little wider than this one? See, that one's like clean. Nice defined seat. And the other one is just, yeah, I don't like that. So hopefully adjusting the valve clearances will bring this cylinder back to spec.